In the centuries after the apostles preached in Greek and Aramaic, the world around the Mediterranean began to change. Rome's empire stretched from Britain to Judea, with roads weaving through mountains and deserts, and its language shaping laws, culture, and commerce. Latin became the language of administration. Soldiers, courts, and ordinary people from Carthage to Gaul, even as Greek continued to dominate the eastern Mediterranean, the western half of the empire gradually turned its attention to Latin. As the language of the people shifted, so did their need for scripture. At first, Christians translated the New Testament informally into Latin, piece by piece and community by community. These early translations, collectively known as the Vetus Latina, the Old Latin, were not a single version, but a collection of many. They varied by region, some closely paraphrased, and others more literal, some elegant and others rough. They developed naturally as believers wanted to hear the words of Christ and the apostles in their own language. But as the centuries went on, the old Latin versions multiplied and diverged from each other until the Western Church was left with a patchwork of scriptural texts, no two exactly alike and none with universal authority. Worship in one city could sound different from worship in another. The old Latin had served its purpose, but it could not keep the growing Western Church unified. In the 4th century, as Rome faced political turmoil and the church transitioned from persecution to imperial support, a bishop named Damasus observed the Western Church and recognized its critical need. The scriptures he understood had to speak with a voice that was clear, unified, and trustworthy. Therefore, he turned to a scholar whose brilliance matched his intensity, Eusebius Hieronymus, known in history as Jerome. Jerome was a man of sharp mind and sharp temperament. Fluent in Greek and Latin, restless in spirit, relentless in study, he traveled east to learn Hebrew from Jewish teachers, becoming one of the few Christians of his time who could read the Old Testament in its original language. His library followed him like a shadow. His letters reveal a man who hungered for precision, who pored over manuscripts with a passion that rivaled the devotion of the Masoretes, who would come centuries later. Damasus asked Jerome to revise the Latin Gospels of the Western Church. Jerome agreed and began a work that would change Christian history. He examined many old Latin manuscripts, corrected them based on the Greek, and produced a new, unified Latin translation of the 4 Gospels. It was not universally accepted. Some believers resisted hearing familiar words changed. But Jerome was persistent. After Damasus died, Jerome left Rome for Bethlehem, where he expanded his work, translating not only the New Testament, but also the Old, not from the Greek Septuagint, but from the Hebrew scriptures themselves. By translating from Hebrew, Jerome took a bold step. Most early Christians read the Old Testament in Greek. Few had access to Hebrew manuscripts or teachers. Jerome's work thus brought the Western Church closer to the Jewish textual tradition than ever before. He consulted Hebrew scrolls, synagogue teachers, rabbinic knowledge, and linguistic forms rarely seen by Christian scholars. His translation sometimes surprised his contemporaries, who wondered why familiar Greek-based readings were replaced. But Jerome's goal was clear: the Western Church needed a Latin Bible that reflected the original languages, not the inherited versions of centuries. Jerome worked for decades in the quiet stone buildings of Bethlehem, surrounded by scrolls and codices, wrestling with languages, debating with Jewish scholars, and writing fierce letters to critics. When he finally finished his translation, book by book, scroll by scroll, it was something the Christian world had never had before: a single, complete, unified Latin Bible based on direct engagement with the earliest sources he could find. Jerome never gave his work a grand title, but over time, as centuries passed and his translation became the Latin Bible used in churches, monasteries, and universities across Western Christendom, it came to be known by a simple name: the Vulgata, the common or popular version, the Bible of the people. This Latin Vulgate, copied in elegant script across illuminated manuscripts and spread throughout every corner of the Western Church, became the scripture that shaped medieval Christianity. Priests chanted it, scholars debated it, monks memorized it, artists painted scenes drawn from its words, kings swore oaths upon it, and theologians, from Augustine to Aquinas, built their works on its foundation. For 1,000 years, the Vulgate was to Western Europe what the Masoretic text was to Judaism, not just a translation, but the form of scripture woven into the identity of a civilization. Its cadences echoed through cathedrals. Its phrasing shaped the liturgy. Its wording influenced theology and doctrine. When the printing press arrived, the Vulgate became one of the first great books to roll off the presses in large quantities, with its letters crisp and uniform for the first time. But with the Reformation came questions. The reformers turned to the Greek and Hebrew originals, producing new translations based on earlier sources. Yet even then, the Vulgate remained a significant witness. In response to the fragmentation of the Western Church, the Council of Trent declared the Vulgate the official Latin text for Roman Catholic use. Later, scholars refined Jerome's work into the Sixto-Clementine Vulgate, 1592, and centuries afterward into the Nova Vulgata, 1979, the modern Vatican revision that aligns more closely with original language scholarship. Through these changes, the Latin Vulgate persisted, not as a relic, but as a flowing stream carrying scriptures through the medieval era into the modern age. It is the text that baptized Europe, the Bible sung in Gregorian chant, the scripture read aloud by monks who painstakingly copied its pages through winter cold and summer heat. It bridged the ancient world and the modern one, standing between Rome's fading empire and Europe's emerging nations. And so the Vulgate joins the great family of scripture traditions, not as the earliest or the latest text, but as the Bible that shaped a civilization. Its story is one of translation and devotion, of a scholar's relentless pursuit of accuracy, and of a church's deep need for unity in a changing world. It rises from the dust of Roman roads, flows through the quiet hours of Bethlehem's cells, and spreads through monasteries, cathedrals, and universities for over a millennium. It is the story of how scripture, once written in Hebrew and Greek, found a new home in the language of an empire, and stayed there long after that empire fell.